The plane sliced through the sky at 30,000 feet, a silver streak against the endless expanse of blue. Inside, the hum of the engines was a constant, comforting rhythm. Passengers read, slept, or stared out the oval windows at the clouds that stretched like an infinite sea below. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks and reassurances in cheerful monotones, the mechanical routine of air travel giving a sense of normalcy to everyone on board. Outside, the sun glinted off the wings, casting brief reflections that flickered across the cabin walls. The world seemed quiet, ordinary, and completely predictable. Captain Reynolds leaned back slightly in his seat, hands resting lightly on the controls, eyes scanning the instruments with professional detachment. His co-pilot, a young man named Mitchell, was reviewing the flight path, occasionally glancing out at the endless sky. Everything was routine, nothing out of place. Reynolds was used to the subtle unease that always lingered at cruising altitude, the awareness that at 30,000 feet, the safety of everyone aboard rested entirely on the skill of those in the cockpit. Yet today, there was nothing to worry about. Or so it seemed. Then it began. The radio, an unremarkable piece of equipment that usually carried nothing more than ATC communications, started to crackle. At first, it was soft static, easily dismissed as interference. Reynolds frowned and reached for the control panel, thinking it was a minor glitch. But the static persisted, growing louder, sharper, almost insistent. Then a faint voice emerged, filtered through the white noise, repeating a series of coordinates. The sound was brittle, mechanical in tone, like an old recording replayed over decades of degradation. Reynolds squinted at the frequency readout. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. Mitchell looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is it?" Mitchell asked, leaning closer. Reynolds hesitated. I don't know. This frequency, it's old. Really old. I think it's been deactivated for decades. This shouldn't even be coming through." The voice repeated the coordinates again, punctuated by static, then fading. Reynolds's unease deepened. He reached for the radio controls, trying to isolate the signal, but the moment his fingers brushed the dials, the voice became clearer, almost eerily precise. Each repetition carried the same tone, the same cadence, as if someone, or something, was deliberately sending a message to them. The coordinates didn't match any flight paths, military zones, or known locations. They were unknown. Mitchell leaned closer to the panel, his face pale under the dim cockpit lights. "Captain, are you sure this isn't a malfunction? I've seen every type of glitch this system can throw at us," Reynolds replied, his voice calm but tight. "This isn't a glitch. This is intentional." He swallowed, glancing at the passenger cabin below. "Whatever this is, it's meant to be heard." Down in the cabin, passengers remained oblivious. They murmured quietly to each other, adjusted their headphones, flipped through magazines. No one noticed the subtle change in the hum of the engines, the faint tension that now seemed to vibrate through the metal walls of the plane. Even the flight attendants, experienced and unflappable, were slightly on edge. One of them, a woman named Harper, paused mid-step, her hand hovering over a tray of drinks as she frowned. Something about the cabin felt wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Back in the cockpit, Reynolds tried to contact air traffic control, but the radio channels were silent. ATC responded to other frequencies, but none acknowledged the mysterious signal that had invaded their instruments. It was as if the voice existed outside of the normal channels of communication, a ghostly intrusion into the modern world. Reynolds' knuckles whitened on the controls as he tried to focus. He had been a pilot for over 20 years, had faced storms, engine failures, even close calls with birds and drones, but nothing had prepared him for the sense of intrusion that the old frequency brought. It was more than sound, it was a presence. Mitchell's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the dials, trying to suppress the static. "Captain, this voice, it's repeating itself, but it sounds, I don't know, urgent. Like it's trying to tell us something." Reynolds nodded, eyes narrowing. He studied the coordinates again, committing each number to memory. Something about them felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. The more he looked, the more he felt a gnawing recognition, a subtle tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The voice repeated once more, and this time it was accompanied by a strange interference that caused the cockpit lights to flicker. Reynolds froze. The plane had experienced turbulence before, electrical glitches before, but this was different. The light flickered in patterns almost deliberate, as if the plane itself were reacting to the message being broadcast through the decades-old frequency. The sense of unease spread to Mitchell. He looked out the window at the clouds below, searching for some rational explanation, perhaps a storm or unusual weather pattern, but the sky was calm, serene, a blank canvas of white and blue. There was nothing to explain the creeping dread that had settled over the cockpit. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice low, firm, though tinged with tension. "We need to document this," he said. "Record the frequency, log the coordinates, everything. We need to know what we're dealing with before it does something we can't fix." Mitchell nodded, fumbling with the onboard recorder. Every click of the buttons seemed amplified in the tense silence. Outside, the clouds drifted lazily past, completely indifferent to the rising panic inside the metal fuselage of the plane. Reynolds took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He was trained to handle emergencies, but this was something new. This was not a storm, not a system failure, not even a hostile pilot. This was unknown. Minutes stretched into eternity as the voice continued, coordinates repeating over and over, each iteration more precise, more insistent. The static seemed to pulse now, like a heartbeat, vibrating through the plane's frame. Reynolds could feel it beneath his palms, beneath the soles of his shoes. Mitchell's eyes widened, and for a moment, the young co-pilot looked as though he might collapse. Reynolds reached over and gripped his shoulder. "Steady," he said, "we'll get through this. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." But deep down, neither of them believed it. There was something unnatural about the intrusion, a sense that the frequency wasn't merely a signal in the electromagnetic spectrum but something more. Something that had waited decades, lying dormant, and had chosen this exact moment to awaken. In the cabin, Harper finally shook off her unease and continued her work, though her steps were cautious, measured. Passengers remained oblivious, chatting quietly, sipping coffee, reading. The normalcy was a fragile veneer over the tension that had gripped the cockpit. Reynolds stole another glance at the coordinates. He knew instinctively that following them could lead to something dangerous, but ignoring them felt worse, as if the frequency itself were aware of their hesitation, watching, testing. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The voice persisted, unwavering, repeating the coordinates with unwavering precision. Reynolds felt sweat bead at his temple. This was no ordinary transmission. It was a summons, a warning, or perhaps a declaration. Then, without warning, the frequency cut out. The static collapsed into silence. The hum of the engines was once again the only sound. Reynolds exhaled slowly, trying to shake the tension from his shoulders. Mitchell mirrored the motion, though his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the controls. "It's gone," Mitchell whispered. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the instruments, scanning, analyzing. Part of him feared that the silence was only temporary, a calm before a storm that neither of them could predict. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside the plane, something imperceptible yet profound, something that had begun to move even as the radio fell silent. Minutes later, the cabin remained calm, passengers chatting, the routine continuing as if nothing had happened. But Reynolds knew better. Somewhere, in the thin air above the clouds, something had awakened, and it had marked them. The old military frequency was more than a relic, it was a signal from a time long past, reaching across decades, cutting through the boundaries of reality to touch this moment in their lives. And Reynolds understood with chilling clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The plane continued to glide through the sky, steady and serene on the surface, but the tension in the cockpit lingered like an invisible shadow. Outside, the sun moved slowly, casting long streaks of light across the fuselage. Inside, the two pilots sat in silence, listening, waiting, knowing that whatever had begun would not simply end with the fading of the signal. It had already begun, and they were now part of it. And somewhere, beyond the clouds and the horizon, a voice waited patiently for its next command to be fulfilled. The passengers had settled back into the rhythm of their flight, unaware of the subtle disturbance that had rippled through the cockpit. The hum of the engines was steady, a familiar and reassuring backdrop to the ordinary sounds of an airplane, the soft rustle of newspapers, the murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of a coffee cup against a tray. Yet beneath this ordinary exterior, tension lingered like a shadow, invisible but palpable. Captain Reynolds' hands rested lightly on the controls, but his eyes never left the instruments. The silence following the mysterious frequency felt heavy, almost deliberate, as if the plane itself were holding its breath. Mitchell sat beside him, shoulders stiff, eyes darting between the controls and the cabin below. He could not shake the sensation that the world had shifted, that something imperceptible yet undeniable was moving through the metal body of the aircraft. The coordinates, recorded and noted, weighed on his mind like an unspoken threat. He could feel the unease spreading, creeping into the back of his neck and settling into his stomach. Reynolds noticed and offered a small, tight smile, meant to reassure but failing to ease the tension. Down in the cabin, passengers began to experience strange occurrences that went unnoticed at first. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, echoed through the headphones of some travelers, though no audio source existed. A page turned in a magazine seemed to flutter against an invisible current, as if touched by something unseen. A man near the back, quiet and unremarkable throughout the flight, began to shift uneasily in his seat. His eyes darted to the window, then to the aisle, as though he sensed something the others could not. He did not speak, but the tension in his body was palpable, a subtle signal that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The whispers grew slightly louder, threading through the cabin in ways that defied explanation. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances but dismissed the occurrences as tricks of the mind or the faint echo of the hum of the engines. Yet the man at the back seemed to respond, stiffening with each repetition. His gaze became distant, focused on some point beyond the plane, as if he were listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. Harper, the flight attendant, noticed him staring and approached with careful politeness, a smile that failed to hide her concern. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked softly. The man's head slowly turned toward her, but his eyes did not seem to see her. Instead, they reflected something deeper, something otherworldly. His lips parted slightly, and a faint murmur escaped them, though no words could be discerned. Harper took a step back, uncertainty prickling at the edge of her professionalism. The atmosphere around him felt different, charged with an energy that made the air hum with an almost imperceptible vibration. In the cockpit, Reynolds and Mitchell felt it too, a shift in the very fabric of the plane, as if the metal and circuitry were responding to an unseen force. The instruments flickered briefly, small lights pulsing in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had experienced turbulence, electrical glitches, even severe weather, but nothing like this. It was as if the plane had become a conduit for something ancient, a message long buried that had finally reached its intended recipient. Back in the cabin, the man's transformation was sudden. His posture stiffened completely, then relaxed as if drawn by an invisible tether. Harper reached out instinctively, but her hand passed through empty air, and he was gone. No scream, no flash of light, nothing to indicate the extraordinary had occurred. Just the faint echo of the whisper, fading into silence, leaving the surrounding passengers confused, staring at the empty seat where he had been moments before. The cabin erupted into murmurs and questions, passengers craning their necks, trying to understand what had happened. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, checking seats, scanning the crowd, unable to account for the missing man. Reynolds, observing the situation through the cockpit's monitors, felt a chill run down his spine. The coordinates from the frequency had led to this moment, a culmination no one could have predicted. Mitchell's voice broke through the tense quiet. "Captain, he's gone. Just gone." His eyes were wide, and his hands gripped the edge of the control panel as if it would anchor him to reality. Reynolds nodded slowly, staring at the empty monitor that had shown the passenger's presence just moments before. There was no explanation, no rational cause. The man had simply vanished, leaving behind only the echo of the whispers and a sense of awe that none on the plane could articulate. The rest of the flight continued in uneasy silence, passengers whispering among themselves, flight attendants trying to restore normalcy. But something had changed. The atmosphere, once mundane and predictable, now carried a weight of tension and uncertainty. The invisible thread that had connected the man to the old frequency had pulled him from the plane, leaving a gap that no amount of explanation could fill. In the cockpit, Reynolds stared at the instruments, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The frequency had stopped, but its effects remained. Something ancient, something beyond comprehension, had reached through the airwaves and touched this moment, marking them in a way that would linger long after the plane touched the ground. And somewhere, in a place beyond human understanding, the whisper that had guided the man was still listening, still waiting, still watching, patient and unyielding. Passengers remained unaware, going about their routines as best they could, but the memory of the missing man's disappearance would haunt them, a silent reminder that the ordinary world could be pierced by the extraordinary at any moment. Reynolds and Mitchell, bound by the shared knowledge of what had occurred, exchanged a look that conveyed what words could not. The flight had changed, the rules had shifted, and they were no longer merely pilots guiding a plane through the sky. They were witnesses to something beyond comprehension, a force that defied explanation, yet existed undeniably in the space they occupied. The plane continued onward, steady in its trajectory, but within its metal hull, tension pulsed like a living entity. Passengers slept, read, or stared out at the clouds, unaware of the invisible thread that had passed through the cabin and claimed one among them. In the cockpit, Reynolds' knuckles whitened on the controls as he realized that the old military frequency had not merely interrupted their flight, it had reached through time and space, leaving an indelible mark on all who had witnessed its effect. And somewhere, beyond the limits of their understanding, the whispers lingered, a signal waiting for its next moment to awaken. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the tarmac with a gentle thud that seemed to echo unnaturally through the cabin. Passengers stirred, stretching and gathering their belongings, exchanging quiet words about the flight. To the casual observer, it had been an ordinary journey, routine and unremarkable. But for Captain Reynolds and Mitchell, the experience had left an indelible mark, a shadow lingering over every sound and movement. The strange frequency, the mysterious coordinates, the disappearance of the passenger, it had all culminated here, and yet the answers remained frustratingly elusive. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, ensuring passengers disembarked safely. Harper's steps were measured, her eyes scanning the rows for any sign of the missing man. Empty seats were checked, monitors reviewed, but there was nothing to suggest he had ever been there. The realization settled over her with a cold weight: he had vanished completely, leaving only the faint echo of a presence that could not be measured or understood. Reynolds and Mitchell remained in the cockpit for a few moments longer, monitoring systems and ensuring that nothing had been damaged or left in disarray. The frequency had disappeared completely, leaving no trace of the signal that had so completely unsettled them. Yet the unease lingered. Reynolds felt a shiver run down his spine as he recalled the voice, the way it had repeated the coordinates with an almost sentient insistence. There was no rational explanation for what had occurred, only the undeniable reality of a passenger gone, claimed by something outside the known boundaries of the world. Emergency teams were waiting at the gate, alerted by the captain's report of the unusual events. They boarded swiftly, checking each seat, reviewing security footage, and asking passengers questions. Each response they received was the same: confusion, disbelief, and the uneasy recognition that something inexplicable had occurred. The missing man could not be found, and the official reports would later describe it as a technical anomaly, an event without cause. But Reynolds and Mitchell knew better. They had seen the impossible unfold, and that knowledge would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Passengers began to exit the aircraft, the flow of bodies moving with the usual hum of airport logistics. Conversations were muted, cautious, as if the collective subconscious of the cabin had sensed the extraordinary event and chosen to quietly acknowledge it without drawing attention. Harper stepped off the plane last, casting one final glance over the rows of seats. The empty chair where the man had sat was a stark reminder that the ordinary world was only a thin veil over forces that could pierce reality in a heartbeat. Reynolds finally left the cockpit, his uniform perfectly in place but his expression unreadable. Mitchell followed closely, shoulders tense, the weight of the invisible encounter pressing down on him. Together, they moved through the cabin, their eyes meeting passengers' glances and noting subtle reactions, confusion, curiosity, and the faintest hint of fear. But none of them could know, none could truly understand, the force that had reached through time and space to claim a life while leaving the world around it untouched. Once the passengers had cleared the plane, Reynolds returned to the cockpit for a final check of the instruments. Everything was functioning normally, the hum of electronics steady, lights flicker-free, systems operating as expected. And yet, in the silence of the empty cockpit, he felt the faint echo of the whispers, a ghostly reminder that the frequency had not been entirely gone. Somewhere, beyond comprehension, the signal lingered, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next moment to reach through the world as it had today. Mitchell broke the silence, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it will happen again?" Reynolds did not answer immediately. He stared out at the runway, the planes taxiing in orderly formation, the world appearing calm and rational. But deep inside, he knew the truth. What they had experienced was not bound by rules, time, or reason. It was a force that operated beyond human understanding, a presence that had chosen them, their passenger, and this flight for its purpose. "I don't know," Reynolds admitted finally, voice low. "But whatever it is, it's still out there. And it's waiting." As they powered down the cockpit and stepped onto the jet bridge, a final thought lingered in Reynolds' mind: the world had grown larger, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous in the moments they had been unaware. The passenger was gone, taken by forces that could not be seen, measured, or understood. And yet, the faint whisper of the old military frequency would remain in their memories, a haunting echo that reminded them that some messages are not meant for the living, but for something far older, far more deliberate, and far more powerful than any of them could comprehend. Outside, the airport moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the invisible drama that had unfolded high above the clouds. Reynolds and Mitchell walked side by side, silent in their understanding, carrying the knowledge of what had transpired. And somewhere, in the unseen corners of the world, the voice waited, patient, precise, and unyielding, whispering coordinates across decades, across planes, across the fragile boundary between the known and the impossible. The plane was empty now, the crew preparing it for its next journey, but the memory of what had occurred lingered in every bolt, every wire, and every surface of its metal frame. For Reynolds and Mitchell, the flight would never be ordinary again. And the whisper, once thought to be gone, had only moved to the edges of perception, waiting, watching, marking the world with a signal that few would ever hear, but none would ever forget.